The question I'm going to ask today, Dad, Papa, is...
The question that we're going to talk about is...
What is the most scared I've ever been? That one leapt off the page for me.
What was my first big trip?
How was the day of your wedding?
I'm going to talk about how I almost died twice in 2 years.
She was telling me her life story, and she didn't know it was me.
That is an absolutely true story.
And I can tell you about it.
Welcome to the Storyworth Podcast. I'm your host, Krista Baum, co-founder of Storyworth. I'm so glad you're here. If you're new to Storyworth, we help people write their life stories, the big stories and the small. Each week on the podcast, we ask questions that help us hold on to a person's life story and get to know our loved ones better. Today, a French-Algerian New Yorker travels to India and has a chance encounter on a rooftop that changes the course of his life.
I was on this long trip many years ago, maybe, more than 15 years ago, and I was traveling to India. My wife at the time, who was doing a PhD, was researching international education, and so I sort of followed her, going to India for one of her research trips. I had traveled the world, a little bit before that, but I wasn't ready for India. It was very different from anything I had imagined. We flew from Mumbai to Delhi, and we were supposed to go, the final destination was this city called Varanasi. Varanasi is very important in Hindu religion because it's beneficial to die in Varanasi for Hindus. Basically, if you die in Varanasi, what you're doing is that you're skipping reincarnations. So that means that you don't have to come back. And then you can go directly to their version of paradise. What that does is that you have this industry, basically, of death, if you will, right? So by the river, you have these places that they call burning ghats. And those places are places where they burn the bodies of the dead in plain sight. And it sounds like, maybe like a horror film experience, when I say it like that. But it's a very profound experience. Suddenly you're in a place where and not just death, actually, a lot of things that I feel we hide or we cover in everyday life, animal, death, poverty, or dirt, are in the open in Varanasi. So we flew from Mumbai to Varanasi, and there was a stop in Delhi. And what I didn't know is that Delhi is susceptible to these huge waves of fog. You could be in the street and you wouldn't be able to see, a couple of feet in front of you. So it's very, very thick fog. So we flew to Delhi, and then we got stuck at the airport because it was one of these days where they were having this, one of these events of fog. And they told us the flight was going to be delayed an hour. And then it became 2 hours. And then it became 3 hours. And then it became, almost 10 hours stuck in that airport, not knowing what was happening because they just couldn't tell, when the flights were going to be able to go. It was really an eerie experience because, you would go to these big windows of the airport, like you find in all the modern airports, basically, and you couldn't see anything through the windows because of the fog. And I was bored, I was restless. So I would do, I would sort of walk around the airport just to just to see what was happening, just to waste some time, etc., etc. And I noticed this woman. She looked European. She was older. At that point, I was assuming she was maybe in her 60s, And I started seeing her on several of these walks. I would just walk past by her, and she didn't notice me, I think. I just noticed her. And that was that. Finally, the fog cleared up a little bit, and we took this flight from New Delhi to go to Varanasi. And the woman disappeared. So we get to Varanasi. We have our little guidebook. We checked like a few things that we thought, like you have to do when you get there. So I think let's walk by the river. So we do that. And then what happens was that you couldn't take a step without having like people around you, like hustling basically, right? For some reason, the memories that I have is that I was trying to buy oranges at some point, like on a stall, like in the street. And he offered me a ganja and pills, and I was thinking, and I remember telling him, I just want orange. but what was interesting also, because even though it was day, we still could not see anything, because each step of the way there would be someone or people that would be there, to interact with you, to take you in a certain direction, to ask something for you, etc. And I had never seen that at that level. And honestly, we don't have a very good experience. But for some reason, we don't leave. I can't explain why, but we're sort of also a bit, like curious, like what is this place, right? But again, not in a enjoyable way. And then I remember we're sitting in the lobby of the guest house, and one thing that they didn't do when we got there, I think it's just we got so late, is that, they're supposed to take all this information about you, right? So you're supposed to give them your passport, and I remember we give our passports to, I think the guy was the owner of the place, who was taking, and he tells us, this is going to take me about 20 minutes. Have you been to the roof? And we said, oh no. And he said, okay, you have a wonderful view. Why don't you go to the roof and just take a moment? And then when you come back, I'll be done with the papers. And said, okay. So we walk up and we get to the roof, and there was this woman sitting at a table on that terrace. And it was that woman from the airport that I was telling you about, like a few minutes ago. And I could not believe it for some reason, like you could think like I was so surprised, to see her. So I just went to her actually, I remember pointing at her and being like, I know you, because my brain was trying to figure things out kind of thing. And then she's a bit startled at first, because really, like, I go to her, like, I know you, or something. So she thinks, she might think I'm crazy by doing that. So I think just trying to, sort of figure out, like, who are these people, showing up. And then I explain, and I say, oh, didn't you come a couple of days ago in the plane, the fog, blah, blah, blah. And she remembers, and she invites us to sit with her at that table, on that terrace, etc. So we sit with her. And we get to learn a little bit about her. She was Danish. She was an ex-hippie. She explained that she had been coming to Varanasi for 40 years, basically. And she said, oh, but what I do now is that when I come to Varanasi, I volunteer at this school. It's called Little Stars School. And that, this Indian woman runs, and, she's an amazing woman, blah, blah, blah. Would you be interested in coming with me? I can take you there. And we said, yeah, sure. And said, and if you want, I can take you to the city and be your guide for a day. So we met with her, and something happened that was really surprising for me, is that I think that because we were with her, and because either people knew her, or because the way she walked, the way she didn't look like she had just arrived the day before like we did. Nobody came to us. And suddenly she took us around, and for the first time, and I'm not kidding, that's how I experienced it, we saw the city. Like it opened up. The same streets we had walked the day before, the same market we had crossed, the same. Suddenly we were able to see it. We were able to stop and just ask. And suddenly also conversations were possible. you could actually interact with people in a different way. So she took us all the way to the school. The school was it started strictly for street kids, and then it became something for sort of poor kids of that area. And when we got there, it was the end of the day, and they were all on the roof of that school, and it was the moment, where they're having, like a fun time after, after a day of school, etc. I remember thinking, like, oh wow, she created this haven for this young girl in a place that was so difficult, so aggressive, and she was able to create this sort of like little bubble where these kids could be kids, basically. And I remember looking at that and being really really touched by that and not knowing exactly why. And then a few days later we left, right? And that should have been the end of it. At the time, I wanted to make documentary films, and I kept that image for months, when I was back in New York. And at one point I thought, what, maybe I can do something with this school. It was pure chance encounters, but what I could feel was that I was looking for something, and then I wasn't sure what it was at the time. But the other question I was asking myself was like, why would I be interested in going to make a film about a school that is 6,000 miles away? I lived in New York. I could have gone anywhere, like a subway distance, and made my life much easier. And I think what I realized after some time was that I had a hole, and I was trying to find ways to sort of fill that hole. And the hole for me was, how do you get back home? And I feel that was the question, how do you get back home? When you have the feeling that you're not, and when you have the feeling that any place that you're in is lacking something about that, right? And for me, home is another complicated story. But I grew up in Paris, but I'm not from. I was not born there. I was born in Algeria, which is a very complicated relation with France, etc. Paris is the closest thing that feels like home. But a weird home, where you don't always feel welcome. So already, I had left Paris, when I was in my 20s to move to New York. I had lived in New York for, at that time, I think it was 10 or 15 years maybe. And from New York, I went to India to try to resolve something about home. So it sounded strange, I was like, why are you making this very complicated journey? Like, what is it that you're looking for? And I realized that one of the things that I was looking for is, I was looking for a way to go back to Algeria somehow. And I couldn't find it, which is the strangest thing, because you could go to a travel agency and buy a ticket, but it's much more complex, right? So I went back to Algeria, where I hadn't gone for many, many years, a couple of years after that, because I realized that I was not going to find my answers in those places, even though these places sort of like opened up this possibility to ask the question. What I'm doing now, I left the job that I had in tech a few years ago, and I started doing a PhD. I could do media studies, basically. So film and photography, etc. But really the reason I was doing that is that I wanted to work on the photography from Algeria. And basically what I did is that I combined this personal need with a potential professional journey, which is that Algeria is now becoming the site of my studies, basically. So I work on photography, and photography is interesting for me because photography is about representation. So when you think about a place that was colonized, for example, the image of yourself was created for you by others. That's what took place in Algeria for 100 years. any image of Algerians were made by the French, basically. And then at one point, when you get closer to independence and things like that, Algerians start sort of, taking the camera over in a way and then turning it and then start creating an image of themselves, right? And I thought that was so interesting for me, because me looking for home, me looking to understand better where I fit, like in this world, like in between all these different poles, basically. This idea of studying photography, studying, images, studying representation, in connection to Algeria, in connection to France, etc., became that way of going back home for me. So in a way, this whole journey that went from, through India, I was able, I think, at one point to understand that, I don't need to go so far in all these directions. I just need to go back to the place of the origins and take it back from there.
That's it for this episode of the Storyworth Podcast. I'm Krista Baum. Thanks so much for listening. If you want to get started writing your own book of life stories, or want to give the gift of Storyworth to a loved one, head over to Storyworth.com. And if you want one of your stories to be considered for the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us at Storyworth.com/podcast. The Storyworth Podcast was produced by the folks at Good Weight Productions. Remember, everyone has a story worth sharing. See you soon.